but I think I can work with that. So thank you so much, Dorian, for inviting me to join you today. I am a former HWP, at that time it was HWPI member, and I have really fond memories of my time there. And since moving on, I've remained a big fan and follower of all the work you're doing in UX and accessibility. And when people ask about like, what are good accessibility programs and where are they doing interesting work with digital transformation and governance, I point to Harvard because of the work that you've been doing. And I just have to say that accessibility homepage was awesome. I love that. So it's such a pleasure to join you today. And there's some old friends and some new ones. And to talk about ways that we as a profession really can look to putting people first. I want to share some thoughts, get some of your ideas on this, share some tools that might help you strengthen your UX and accessibility practices by prioritizing people. The view that I have, I can't see the chat or anything like that. Oh, I guess I can.
I'll let you know if anything comes up.
Yeah. Great. So, for a practice that focuses on improving people's lives, that is to say accessibility, we spend remarkably little time talking about people. We spend a lot of time talking about things like technical specifications and standards. I'm involved in accessibility guidelines working groups, and we spend many meetings talking about technical nuances and loopholes. And I can debate at length, whether one failure applies to one success criteria or the other. And that a lot of the time that we talk about accessibility, that's the nature of the conversations. And when we do talk about people, it's very often in the context of these potential barriers that they may experience due to conformance defects. So, for example, you'll see, a lot of people will say this site is inaccessible, and that's based on the results of some automated test or because it fails some technical success criteria. I mean, there are a lot of lawsuits that are based on audits rather than people encountering barriers. Because of this focus, accessibility has really come around to being perceived as kind of a technical burden, a technical debt that we need to pay off in installments. And the thing is that accessibility should really be about what people can do. I got involved in accessibility in early 2000 when I learned about screen reader technology and how enabling it is to access text. And as a UX designer, I was really excited about this opportunity to do something more than create like snazzy graphics and spiffy layouts and stuff like that. But mostly what accessibility is about is what people can't do. And that is really defined by these audits or conformance assessments. So why don't we put people first in our accessibility practice? Why don't we look at accessibility in this way? Why are we kind of more comfortable with the abstract technical issues than talking about people? And what would happen if instead of focusing on those standards and fixing conformance errors or defects, we focus on people and making technology work for people first? So we're going to explore this question of why don't we put people first, both in the question like, why don't we put people first? And then the sort of appeal of why don't we put people first, And that's what we're going to talk about today. So part one is this discussion of why we don't focus on people. In part two, I'm gonna share some thoughts about how we might shift our thinking to putting people first. And in part three, we're gonna review some tasks and tools that we can use to support a people first approach. So in part one, I'm going to just a note sort of on logistics. In part one, I am going to ask you to spend a few minutes thinking and making note of your thoughts. And as Doria mentioned, you can share your thoughts in the chat. There's also a Google Doc, the session notes document, there's a link in the chat to that you can add your thoughts to it. I'd like to, if you're willing to share your thoughts in that way, I would revise my slides and incorporate some of your thoughts into them, which I would then share back to Dorian to put out as a resource for you, because this is an initiation of a conversation that I hope will continue.
Sorry, Sarah, one quick thing. It looks like I don't have edit access to that document. Is everyone experiencing that? Or is that just my special situation?
Yeah, me too, but there's a request edit access button at the top.
Yeah.
So I assume that it's, not to just leave it as a free for all for any anonymous person with the link to just immediately edit, but to have a little speed bump before editing.
Yeah. I would love it if I had been that thoughtful about it, but no, it's just an oversight on my part. So I'm jumping over there and I'm going to fix that up.
Thank you.
Because my thinking was that you'd be able to add things as we go. So let me just do this and hopefully that will let you in. Can you refresh and let me know? Oh, does that work?
Yes.
Yay. Yay,
Thank
technology. You. So just a quick note about me. I've been working in tech since the late 1980s, before there even was a web. I spent most of my career in higher ed. I started at Yale, spent a lot of time at Dartmouth, and ended up at Harvard before saying, I've had enough of higher ed. And after that, I left Harvard to become an accessibility consultant with the Paciello Group, where I worked for 7.5 years or something like that. And currently I'm a researcher of all things at the University of Southampton. And I'm working on a project about teaching accessibility. And so it's really, really interesting, a really neat project. And I encourage you to sort of keep track of what's happening there. I'm also an independent consultant. I've been doing a few mainly user research projects, learning from experts, people with accessibility needs, which makes it all the more keen to me to try to explore this question of why don't we put people first? So given the clear value that we all experience from learning from experts, why is it that we don't put people first generally in UX and technology design, and very specifically disabled people? Why aren't we seeking out perspectives to inform our accessibility practice? And for this part, I'm afraid I really don't have the answers. I have a lot of questions and I have a few thoughts. And so we're going to start out sort of exploring this together and what keeps us from focusing on people. And just a few thoughts to start us out. One is maybe it's because we work in tech. And so we're going to focus on technology because that's the field that we're working in. And that's sort of what's interesting to us. Another thought is that user needs are really complex and multifaceted, and it's difficult to account for, especially when we're talking about diverse user needs. And, just generally, people are really messy and kind of hard to deal with and hard to wrangle. And so maybe it's just more straightforward for us to think about technology design and development from a point of view that's abstracted from the messy part of people. One thing I think we all experience is it takes time to consult with users and get user perspectives, and we often don't have time. And another thought is that it's just sort of more fun in a way to solve technology puzzles, where many of us might have ended up in working in technology because we like solving the puzzles. So that's just a start of thoughts on that. If you could just take a few minutes, I'm just going to pause for you to think a bit about why we don't focus on people in our UX and accessibility practices. And you can note your thoughts either just, on a sheet of paper or in your mind, or however you want to do it. You can put them in the chat. You can add them to that Google Doc. So I'm just pausing. And hoping that you have some thoughts that you will share. So I'm seeing from Gabriel the thought that we like to diagnose and treat symptoms instead of thinking about people in a holistic way, like we do in healthcare. And I think it comes back to the messy part of people. We're complicated critters. In the work that you're doing day to day, am I correct in this assertion that we don't focus on people? You can also disagree with that assertion? And feel free just to speak up as well. Claire says there's an emotional labor associated with thinking about people. It can feel safer to keep distance. That's so true. Especially when we're pressed for time and we don't really have the resources, the sort of well of energy and that we need to be able to draw on. Timothy says we think we already think we know, which is a really good point. Yeah, we think we know what people need, and so we don't need to consult with them. And I would add on to that sometimes we think we know because we know our own experience so well, and we sort of translate our experience to everyone's experience, which means we build things that we can use, but maybe other people can't. Kay mentions that standards are a discrete task or a set of tasks that need to be accomplished, and it's easier to solve a defined task, absolutely, than to figure out how to account for outliers. That's so true. Again, back to the messy aspect of things. Seth mentions that we define needs based on business or stakeholder needs, not learners, and that is spot on. At least in my experience, even back with HWPI, that, you know, a lot of that work was driven by business needs, and it was a real push to get people to start thinking about users. And that's, you know, it's not unique to Harvard. Well, that's great. And I would love if, you know, we'll take Dorian, and we'll make sure to save the transcript for the chat and bring these together into the slides. But if you have other thoughts on the what keeps us from focusing, please share them in the Google Doc, if that works for you, or in any other way that works. So then we want to talk a little bit about the costs of that. And so the costs of not focusing on people. And again, some initial thoughts. Our concept of user needs is really undeveloped. It's pretty unnuanced. I mentioned earlier, it might be very mirror our own needs. And our definition of user experience is narrow. It's a very narrow notion of what constitutes a user experience. And, you know, very often we're building technology that people can't use. And whether that's one person or many people, I think that is everyone's choice to decide how many people require attention, especially when we're talking about causing harm. And within the realm of accessibility, we can really look to specific instances, not only in accessibility, in many aspects of technology development, where not putting people first results in harm to users. So again, if you would think a little bit about the costs of not focusing on people from your perspective, are there other costs that we should be aware of? I want to add one that the previous slide reminded me of, is that we lose, there's a huge opportunity cost, because by not looking to the margins, you know, looking at what seem to be edge cases, we lose out on opportunities to develop really innovative and useful technologies. A lot of the technologies that we use today and benefit from arose out of attention to user needs, accessibility needs. And by not looking into those edge cases, we lose out on an opportunity to innovate and do something interesting. Fines, there are lots of great feedback. Adrian is talking about fines and fees because people are suing for non-compliance, which is definitely happening a lot. Curtis talks about time and effort spent making the wrong thing, which is very painful and so true. Zoraida talks about perpetuating stereotypes by making assumptions of what people need. Absolutely. Kay talks about offering users and making them feel that the library isn't othering users. Absolutely, along the same line. Making people feel as though these resources aren't meant for them. And Timothy mentions the missing out on reputation. Gabriel talks about reputational costs. Zoraida, losing trust, absolutely. And Seth mentions not focusing on folks means not finding or being able to solve for real objectings. Objectives, yes, absolutely. So again, if you keep having ideas about the costs, I think it would be great to make note of those and add those into the Google Doc. And again, I'll summarize them and add them into the slides. So the next part is to look at how might we put people first. And with this, I want to just put a few ideas forward on this for you to think about and react to. And to do that, I'm going to kind of take us on a path through history. But starting off with this, a quote from The Tipping Point, which honestly, I haven't read the book. So it's one of those books I feel like I get just by reading the title, and I will read it at some point. But this concept of tipping points is super interesting, and we're going to talk through that. But the quote is, "Look at the world around you. It may seem like an immovable, implacable place. It is not. With the slightest push in just the right place, it can be tipped." So we're going to explore this notion of tipping points by walking through web history, where there have been problems that led to these tipping points and then caused significant changes and improvements. And one of those, way back in 1998, is web standards. And I don't know how many of you were doing web work in 1998. You're welcome to raise your hand or thumbs up or however you want to account for yourself. But you might remember, harken back to those times where there was no uniform support for web standards. And as a result, it was really difficult to develop websites and applications that worked across platforms and browsers. And so we did terrible things. I wrote books that taught people how to do terrible things, like layout tables and spacer GIFs. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. And we had to create different documents for different browsers, and we do browser sniffing and all of these things. And it was just not a great time. And so at that point, there was a push. It became a tipping point because it was such a mess. And as a result, we started developing to web standards. And we pressured browser makers to support the standards. We said goodbye to Netscape Navigator and Internet Explorer. You know, really good things happened. So that was, in my mind, a tipping point where we really recognized that we had to take action in order to set things right. And we are on a better path now with respect to web standards. Another similar tipping point came with content first design, which was around 2008. And that was at a time where we had really immature website development practices. And, you know, again, those of you who are around for that, I like to think of it as a time where website development began with a sketch on a napkin from a client, and they'd be like, "I want you to make this for me," and you'd make it. You'd make your Photoshop mock-up. You'd pour in a whole lot of lorem ipsum text, and when it came time to add content, after the excruciating task of pulling that content out of the content providers, there would be this fundamental mismatch between the architecture and design and the content that needed to go in it. And the solution to that was to switch to this content first approach, content first design, where you're starting with the content, building out your content inventory, creating an architecture based on your content, not on your organizational structure. And the form of the thing that you produce follows the function that it needed to provide. So content first design was another sort of tipping point. And another is mobile first. So around 2009, there was this notion, there was an explosion in the use of mobile devices. And at that time, we were developing a distinct mobile website. And again, doing, you know, all kinds of things behind the scenes to make things work. So we would do things like hide content and functionality in the mobile view, but the users still had to download all that data. You know, we do all of these workarounds to try to make sure that people got relevant content on their mobile devices. Or we'd have different documents, different websites for desktop and mobile. And again, it was just really difficult and expensive to maintain. So that was a tipping point. And at that point, we switched to starting with mobile and designing for what matters most in the mobile context, and then building out to other contexts based on that. So with these in mind, my thinking is that accessibility could be that push that tips technology in general toward putting people first. Accessibility has urgency that other attributes lack. No one gets sued for really bad usability, but you can get sued, as that has been brought up in the chat. You can get sued for accessibility because that's discrimination on the basis of disability. And so let's kind of translate this mobile first structure into a people first concept. And think about, well, maybe it's time. You know, what's the year for people first? So there's an explosion from accessibility. There's an explosion in the number of ADA lawsuits. Similarly, there was an explosion in mobile devices, you know. So, and so if we think about the result of that, we're trying to develop accessible websites and applications, and it's unnecessarily difficult and expensive because we haven't had a people first approach. We've had to build it and then remediate it, build it and fix, address defects, fix the bugs kind of approach. And so one thing that happens as a result of that is we try to slap accessibility into an existing structure, like putting a access ramp on the landing dock of a loading dock of a building. And we see things like overlays coming along to save the day, you know, that will fix all the accessibility errors, or maybe there's an accessibility mode that you add into your product so that it'll work with assistive technology. But if we started instead with accessibility needs, and if we started our design with people with disabilities in mind and had this sort of people first approach, then perhaps things would be better. And we could change the course of design to put people first and really influence a lot of other good outcomes for technology in general. So those are some thoughts on that. And again, in the interest of time, I will ask, hopefully that has sort of inspired you to think a little bit about this concept of people first, maybe even as a movement, you know, or a methodology, or, you know, something that we can join forces on and move forward and think about, like, what might that look like if we were to do something like that? And how might that influence your thinking and your practice? So with the last part of the presentation, I have pulled together a set of tasks and tools that you might use to adopt that methodology. So similarly with Mobile First, the concept was presented, but then other people filled in with methodologies. So progressive enhancement came out of that, responsive web design came out of that. So in this next section, we'll look at some of the tasks and tools that we might put into play to support this type of movement. Just starting out with People First, and this is a quote from A Web for Everyone, which I co-authored with Whitney Quisenberry. People First, designing for differences, is the first principle of the accessible UX principles and guidelines. And with People First, people are the first consideration, and sites are designed with the needs of everyone in the audience in mind. So if we do that by putting people first in your professional practice, you can look to different tools that are available. And so in this section, I'm going to present a task, which is put people first in your professional practice. I'll present a tool that you might be a notion of tools that might be able to support that, and an example of a tool that you can use that I'm aware of. And my goal is to build up a toolkit. And if you have ideas for additional tools, I'd love it if you would add them into that Google Doc, and we can really flesh this out together. So to put people first in professional practice, you might look for tools that define those practices in professional codes. And the good news is with all of these tools, there are some that exist already. So the ACM Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, it includes a whole bunch of really helpful stuff. But it clarifies accessibility as part of professional conduct in many different ways. But this particular section that I've quoted here is very specific, and I'll read it. Be fair and take action not to discriminate. The use of information and technology may cause new or enhance existing inequities. Technologies and practices should be as inclusive and accessible as possible, and computing professionals should take action to avoid creating systems or technologies that disenfranchise or oppress people. Failure to design for inclusiveness and accessibility may constitute unfair discrimination. So this section of the code is one of the clearest, most explicit statements that I have seen of our ethical requirements as computing professionals to do accessibility. When we adopt accessibility as an ethical requirement, we can look to case studies that apply ethics to accessibility. And this is from a case study that I actually wrote in response to the ACM code, just trying it out. Like, how does that code apply to accessibility in software development? And you can read the case study, but I just extracted one part of it here to show that indeed case studies show that you can really apply ethics to accessibility. And so as part of this case study, various roles at the company played a part in unnecessarily limiting disabled people's ability to work by releasing inaccessible software onto the market. Had professional practice been guided by Principle 1.4 from the code, which I just read on the previous slide, everyone involved would have redirected efforts toward an accessible approach and implementation in their own work and the work of their colleagues. So these case studies can help you adopt accessibility as an ethical requirement for your professional practice. Building a people-first foundation is another there's a tool to support that, which is a declaration of people first aims and values from the manifesto of accessible UX. I'm hoping that you'll take a close look at all of these tools and put them into your toolkit. I love this one especially, so I'm going to read it, but I think from here on out, I'll have to stop reading my slides for the sake of time. When we examine accessibility through the lens of user experience, we see that accessibility is a core value, not an item on a checklist, a shared concern, not a delegated task, a creative challenge, not a challenge to creativity, an intrinsic quality, not a bolted on fix, about people and not technology. The rest of the toolkit has additional tasks and tools in it. And those tasks are related to people first processes. There are regulations. In this case, the tool that I'm sharing is from the CVAA, which is a law, and it requires that manufacturers consider accessibility early in the design stage and identify barriers in evaluation. So there are regulations and standards that specify processes to follow that you can draw on. There are ways to center on user needs. And these are, again, from a regulatory and standards perspective. There are regulations and standards that define those needs. So the 508 standards, the refresh and the older one as well, has these functional performance criteria where it's a technical standard, but it talks about users in kind of an abstracted sense. But whatever it is that you build needs to be usable without vision in this case. Again, the CVAA goes a little bit further with their performance objectives and talks specifically about providing visual information through auditory forms. So if you really can kind of dig around in some of these guidelines, there are user-focused specifications in there that you can draw on and bring people back to say, hey, we need to make sure that, there's an auditory form of any visual information that we provide if we're building a kiosk, for example, or in this case, a television menu system. Another thing is to look at the intents that are behind accessibility requirements. If you've done any work in accessibility, you probably have been working with the web content accessibility guidelines, which can be pretty difficult to parse at times and to find the users in the guidelines. But behind all of the success criteria are intent statements in the understanding documents that say the intent of this success criteria about status messages is to make sure that users are aware of changes in content when they're not given focus. So looking at those intents is also kind of a helpful way to learn about the requirements. Again, there are tools, regulations, and standards that specify accessibility user research. So in this case, it's an ISO standard that you could adopt and apply to your practice that talks about consulting with users, including users with disabilities and older users, as part of your practice. And the last tool in the toolkit is the accessibility personas. These are from A Web for Everyone, and personas for accessible UX. So you're you probably have worked with personas where you have a fictional perspective on different facets of user experience and things that people are trying to accomplish. And so with the personas in A Web for Everyone, there are 8 personas, and they speak throughout the book and bring that voice, bring that perspective, and illustrate diverse user needs. So I'm going to pause at this point in the presentation and see if you have any questions.
Sarah, this has been really useful for me, as you know, the stage that we're in right now on our team, making sure that we are trying to be as accessible as possible in anything that we, output, and trying to determine, like, what does that mean, right? We know that there is a policy, and that's sort of the letter of the law, but also there's that intent that you talked about, understanding philosophies and determining, like, okay, what is our set of principles that we're going to use? And having a toolkit like this, is incredibly helpful for us to build those principles and say, okay, this is what we all agree upon that we are going to do, and this is how we're going to, present ourselves to the world, and this is what we're going to offer to the world. So it's really, really helpful.
Great. As I was talking through the tools, I realized there's a lot there. So I hope I've given you enough of a taste that you'll go and look into them in more depth. But it was exciting to pull it together and realize that we have so much to work with. So we're not just starting from square one. And there are these foundational things that we can draw on that are part of our profession already. So I think it's kind of an exciting time to do accessibility from this perspective, because it's much less of the audit, repair, technical debt type mentality and much more embedded and integrated into practice. I think that's the trend anyway.
So how are you going to take this further? Are you going to form a working group, or?
Well, at this point, I don't have any specific plans. I did, you always can tell what you're up to by the domain names that you buy. So I did buy peoplefirstdesign.tech, and I've been thinking about this a long time, honestly, really since writing A Web for Everyone, and realized, I wanted to call that book People First. But it was too soon, people wouldn't have understood what the heck it was about. But yeah, I do feel like there is much more attention to dark patterns and manipulative interfaces and harm, technology harm, representation in media. Like people are just becoming more ethically focused in tech development, and user expectations. Our expectations are higher, and I feel like there is a moment right now, and I'm hoping others of you would want to join in, and so that's my last slide, which I will get to in a moment, is just asking if this is something that resonates for you and you want to be involved. I'm just doing this really in the back of my mind as I'm doing lots of other things. So it's not something that is like a business proposition or anything. But if it's something that's interesting to you to explore and build out, I'd love to have people join me. And so you could actually, so you can add your name at the end of that Google Doc. Great question, Hilda. So one approach is just to add, if you are interested, add your name to the Google Doc. You can email me directly. I think what I want to do, so I have like a couple more slides, and I think I'll just go ahead and go through them. So one thing about the personas, for example, like this is just a very practical example. The next slide has the personas on it. I recently was working on a project for a client where I took these personas and took a whole bunch of user research, and I took the persona images and what we'd written up on the Web for Everyone about this. This is Trevor that's on the screen right now. And I took this research and I restructured it so that Trevor illustrated this research. And so the research was done independent of Trevor, but there was enough detail there that I could create a credible representation of him in this context. And so I invite you to take these persona images, and which are all online for free. And that link is also in the slides and on the Google Doc. But so this is Trevor, who's a high school student on the autism spectrum, and he's shown here looking at a touchscreen tablet. He looks puzzled. Emily is a college student who has cerebral palsy. She's shown here using a joystick to navigate her wheelchair down a sidewalk. Jacob is a paralegal who's blind, and he's shown here working with his computer and a refreshable Braille keyboard. Leah is an editor who has fatigue and pain from fibromyalgia, and she's shown here working on her computer with a headset and a special keyboard. Stephen is a graphic designer who's deaf, and he is shown here with drafting tools, and he's using his mobile device and signing to communicate with someone. Vishnu is an engineer who has low vision, and he's shown here working with several technology tools. He has a keyboard with inverted colors, yellow with black type, not inverted, but high contrast, and he has a magnifier. Maria is a community health worker who's bilingual. She works on mobile devices, generally out and about. And here she's meeting with clients using her device for translation. And Carol is a retired bookkeeper. She has macular degeneration, and she's shown here reading a book, a large print book with her cat on her lap. And so these are our tools, these images you can use and make apply some of your own findings to them and bring those accessibility insights to life.